Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. So this is one of the presentations from the Embodiment Conference. So I guess many of you know the Embodiment Conference was a huge event over 2 weeks where over 140 speakers led presentations on embodiment. Now, a lot of these were visual. Some of them were more kind of talking based though. We thought, you know what, we could give some of these away as part of the podcast. So listening to this, you may hear references to questions or things in the chat. We've tried to select ones that they're not demonstrating too much visually, obviously. If it piques your interest, you can always see, you can always buy the full package of Embodiment Conference recordings, a bit of an encyclopedia, actually. Embodiment Netflix, someone was calling it. And that is available if you just Google the Embodiment Conference. I'm sure you'll be able to find a link to that. This is one of the speakers, and as I say, it's a bit different. May or may not be me interviewing them, presenting it. It's mostly them just doing their thing, and excuse the sort of occasional references to comments or visual demonstrations. And it just seemed like a lot of the speakers were extremely kind of high-level people, and it's stuff we wanted to make available. So here it is.
We have here today Don Hanlon Johnson. So Don Hanlon Johnson, I think, is one of the granddaddies of somatic and embodied work. He has been doing this for longer than I've been alive, really in the hub of it, first of all, places like Esalen, now at the Californian Institute of Integral Studies. He's a professor there, strong background in Rolfing, author of many books, a very learned guy, going back to being a Jesuit. There's an interesting story or two in there. And he's just recently published a book on diverse bodies, which is relevant to a lot of the sort of hot topics that have come up in the conference. I've got a personal thank you to Don as well, because he was one of the first sort of big names who came on the podcast and also signed up for the conference. And the way it works with these things, if there's someone recognizable and respected, when you go to other teachers, they say yes. So he's actually been really integral in building both the podcast, which helped build the conference, and the conference itself. So a person who's been generous to me, and I'm super happy to be chatting today. Don, welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
So what's the state of embodiment in 2018?
Well, let me first say a big thanks to you, because I realize in following this conference through that you and I share a particular work, which is to create community. So I'd say one of the core this coming here today has kind of given me a chance to review my long history in this field, which now is about 50 years long. And I realized that the core of my work really is trying to create a large community that takes embodiment seriously. And I love what you're doing here, because it's part of that movement to bring all these different people together so that there can be some impact on the mess we're in. And I've been thinking lately, because of my age, about two of my kind of lights of inspiration, Carl Rogers and David Bohm, who at my age, they gave up their work and they just went around the world to hotspots and got people to talk to each other. And I think that move that you've made here, getting lots and lots of people to share their work, is really admirable, and I really respect you for that. And so thanks a lot for doing that.
Thanks, Don.
And I know how hard it is. So
yeah, Danielle did a lot of the heavy lifting. What's come out of the conference, actually, is, I was going to say this at the end, but it seems worth mentioning, is one, a lot of online community. For the first time, I've seen that around embodiment. And Danielle is launching something called the Embodiment Portal afterwards, which is an ongoing online community. And then we've also encouraged people to start little groups, and we're up to about 40 cities starting embodiment groups that are taking this ongoing. So it's not just you're coming at the end of the conference, but the beginning of what's a sort of new wave in this movement, effectively, which we just weren't expecting to happen.
That's fabulous. Yeah. So then, to get to your question, I'm going to talk about what's up front on my mind right at this moment. So I think probably most of you know we've just 2 days ago came out of the worst fire in our history. So for 2 weeks I couldn't go out of the house without a mask. downtown San Francisco was like New Delhi and Beijing. Everybody with masks on and these clouds of smoke. It was pretty horrendous. I wasn't able to do my daily exercises outside and running and walking and all that. And the last couple of days, I got really assaulted. My lungs are pretty bad shape. And then yesterday, my wife and I drove up to Ashland, Oregon, where some of my family lives, for Thanksgiving. And I don't know how many of you know this fact, but the latest fire was only the last in a series that's gone on over a year. So we drove from San Francisco up the Sacramento Valley, about 5-hour drive directly north through the valley. And on either side were the ravages of a year of fires.
Yes.
So just before you get to Ashland, the trucks is a major artery for trucking. They were held up for like 2 weeks. The road was closed. The freeway was closed because of smoke. So it's like we're in the middle of the state burning. And the reason I'm bringing that up is one of the things that I've kind of noticed as my career has unfolded in this world is a number of people talk as if embodiment is an easy thing. You just are going to decide to pay attention to your breathing, pay attention to your feet, pay attention to your joint movement, and don't realize what a difficult task that is. And so I want to talk a little bit about this condition that we're dealing with now in terms of what it really means to go on a path of embodiment, how serious a turn that is. And I was reminded the first time I became aware of this in the field. I was working as a rolfer in the early days, and one of my clients was a woman about 25 years old who had grown up in Glendale, California. And her energy was extremely low. Her flesh looked very deprived, and her breathing was extremely shallow. And I asked her, well, what something about her breathing, and she says, well, I was brought up not to breathe because Glendale, for those of you who know California geography, is where all the smog blew in from the ocean up against the mountains. So Glendale was often buried in smog. And she was told as a child, it's dangerous for you to breathe. And I remember at that time thinking, well, how on earth do you turn that around at so many years later when you get this primitive lesson of it gets built into the tissues? So to me, that was a really primal example of it not being so easy just to start becoming embodied, that there are all these many problems that we have to face. And I think one of the people that has really paid attention to that is Peter Levine. So his somatic experiencing. Peter was one of the people early on who said, you just don't plunge into experience. Yes. You have to titrate it. You have to go slowly so that you don't get whacked by the dragons that are attacking you from all sides and then just say, well, I'm forgetting this. That's enough. I don't want to do that. So am I on track here? I just want to check in.
Yeah, we are. We had
talked too long without.
We had Betsy Politan on, who was one of Peter Levine's top students. And I think she was one of the best speakers we had on. And we've had a number of others from the sort of trauma. We had a whole trauma track and some sort of sensitivity to the difficulties of becoming embodied and the barriers there.
Yeah. So I think that one of the things that I've noticed over the years is there's both a profundity of turning towards the embodiment that's opening up intelligence, creativity, imagination, and there's a difficulty in it that's proportionate to the treasures that are there. So it's so the kind of the prevalence of the mindfulness word seems to be to make it seem a little too easy, that it's just a matter of turning to my breathing. Whereas right now, turning to my breathing is a big problem. So that's the first place that I think of going. So I think over the years, I've thought a lot about a metaphor for me of the embodiment process is backcountry wilderness, backpacking and backcountry skiing and camping. And the reason the metaphor is useful to me is that you can look, I'm looking out my window here at the Cascade Mountains. You can say, let's go out into the Cascades. But first of all, where are you going to go? There's very dangerous territory. There's dangerous animals. There's extreme weather. It takes a lot of strategies to go into a wild country. And the revelations you get there are going to depend upon how much work you've done to negotiate a particular dimension of that territory. So I like to think of embodiment as really learning how to navigate a particular region of the wilds, and over time, many regions of the wilds. And then it takes time and it takes daily practice. I think the notion of practice is extremely important. I notice now more and more the students that we have in our program, they're not quite, many of them they're not familiar at all with the notion of practice.
Yes, it's more into Western learning, isn't it? And I've been saying to the people on the conference the last day or two, like, hey, coming out of the conference, it's great to have learned a lot, but please pick a practice. Please have a practice coming out of the conference.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like the very nature of the body is it's slow. It's really slow to, I can tell you after 85 years, I'm still struggling with things I've struggled with for 50 years to try to modulate, to turn around. It's not easy. So I think the notion of practice is really crucial. And in that regard, I see that notion as kind of related to what you're trying to do here in this conference, and I have tried to do over my lifetime. There's a certain way you can look at all the body practices, and they all like little churches, and they can get in all these fights about who's got the right way and who's better than the others, and yada, yada, when in fact we need all the help we can get. So I think that really supporting many, many practices so that people have the opportunity to do what draws them, so that people can find something that works for them.
And Don, what's been fantastic about this conference, and I really wasn't expecting this, is there's been very little cross-fighting, fundamentalism. You know, you once said to me at Esalen, they had this saying that no one captures the flag.
Right.
I really kept that in mind with this conference from that interview I did with you. And the first day it happened in one instance, and I just immediately said, this doesn't happen here. And we set a culture where it wasn't happening. And I think we didn't have to work that hard because it feels like there's much more cross-fertilization happening now and much less infighting. Certainly at this, I mean, people can nod if that's their experience, but I just haven't heard any speakers try and say this is the one true way and all the others are blasphemers, which I actually wasn't expecting. And that's been
fabulous.
Fantastic.
That's fabulous. Yeah. Yeah, because I remember I was thinking as I was reviewing my past to get ready for this, I was remembering crazy things that went on in my early days. For example, Ida Rolf and Moshe Feldenkrais and F. Matthias Alexander used to argue, where does the third cervical vertebrae belong? I mean, if you could imagine, that was a pretty crazy conversation.
Angels on the head of a pin, huh? From your theological
and also the notion that there is a ideal of where the third cervical vertebrae belongs, no matter where you're from or what your body's like or what your history's been. So there are some pretty crazy items about that. And I think that one of the things that I learned at Esalen, I talked to you about earlier, was it made a big difference to have dinner together. It was like, having a place where you could schmooze together. It took the edges off these crazy abstract arguments.
Yes. One of the most popular things at this conference is after every speaker, we have these breakout rooms on Zoom where people get to talk to each other. And that's been one of the most popular features is we call it the coffee breaks, lounges. And it's replicated the idea of a conference where you chat to people. And actually, if I'm looking at this screen, I've actually made proper friends with some of these people this week,
That's cool.
We were not expecting the degree of emotion and connection to happen online that happened. That was just a genuine surprise. We thought it would be mostly sort of heady, and it hasn't been.
Well, that kind of leads me or triggers me to talk a little bit about a big channel of inspiration in that for me, which I opened my new book with, which is Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road Project. So about 15 years ago, maybe 12, I forget, when Clinton was leaving his presidency, he gave Yo-Yo Ma the Presidential Medal of Honor, and Yo-Yo Ma conceived the Silk Road Project. And I heard his opening address. He said, what he's noticed over the years is that you travel anywhere on the Silk Road from Kamchatka to Prague, and you find musicians who love playing with each other. And they're inspired by playing with each other, no matter whether they can understand each other's languages or not. And with everybody around them fighting, And he says, artists and musicians understand better than politicians how to create a communal world. And so I was very inspired by that. And Yo-Yo Ma comes to Berkeley every year with some of these musicians. So I thought that was a really good model for cymatics, that when we're working at the level of feeling, sensing, kind of sensual connection with each other, with our eyes and facial expressions, really learning to tune into those things rather than our abstract arguments, it creates a matrix of moving together and joining together that's very hard if a person's disembodied.
Yes. One thing Daniela and I discovered in this conference, as is inevitably the case with 15,000 people, there were complaints or arguments or concerns. And one thing we discovered was that to leave people voice messages so they could hear our voices rather than type to them. And we found that much more successful in resolving some of the conflicts because they could hear we were human beings. And except for
that's very interesting. Yeah.
Something we learned, right, Daniela?
Yeah. Email is such a dangerous medium, and text for that very reason. It's really great.
So I'm struck by, talking about the fires, and we've talked about, me and you have talked about the difficult politics around the world and the divisiveness of left and right and the environmental situation. I wonder if in some ways maybe things have sort of got bad enough that the embodiment tribe is kind of coalescing a little bit.
Well, it may be, because I must say that I just, after this long drive yesterday through California burned, it was pretty devastating to see how, so my wife and I, it started all last summer when my wife and I were camping on the east side of the Sierras over on the very high mountain passes around 13,000 feet. And Yosemite was closed because there were fires in Yosemite. And every day around noon, the smoke would come over the summit and we'd have to deal with smoke. So we've been dealing with smoke since then, since June in California, everywhere.
Yes, I interviewed Michaela Boehm, I think, last winter, and a house had burnt down the day before I interviewed her. And that was nearly a year ago.
Yeah. So it may be, I mean, the sad thing about us is both personally and socially, is it seems to me we need disasters to wake up. And I mean, all the heroism that went on in Europe during the two wars and the recovery from the two wars. And, we have many instances around the world. So maybe that will be the way out. And with our crazy president, who's...
Thank God for Trump.
Yeah, right. So it may be, I'm hoping that that's the case, because it certainly is, it feels like the end of the world here.
We call it a rock bottom in addiction recovery.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. And it is puzzling, like for the first time, I've grown up in where my ancestors came here in the gold rush, and it's really the first time I've really taken seriously that my home might burn. Mm-hmm. So my wife and I have been thinking about now, how do we keep our home from burning? That's kind of weird at this stage of my life to be suddenly saying, I've thought of earthquakes. One of the first things we did was get our house earthquake proof, but I haven't really taken seriously fires. But to think all of California might burn is pretty sobering. Yeah,
I mean, it's partly regional, this, in my experience, in that the United States hasn't had serious threat for a long time, serious famine for a long. It's why everyone freaked out about 9/11 so much. Right. Like in Russia or somewhere like that, there's famines and live in memory. Yeah. Europe's had wars. Africa, forget about it, different level. Yeah. But there's been a different sense of safety, I think, out there for a long time.
So I guess as I put these thoughts together with you, I think what I'm kind of beginning to form in my mind is quite of a survival cymatics. Like, how do you get through these tragedies? I think we don't. For example, I think one of the things we don't emphasize enough in our program is courage. Building up a body that's resilient, that can handle adversity, so that at the first whiff of smoke, I don't just collapse, but I can somehow navigate these crises. And I would like to see, I think this is where the martial arts wing of cymatics is very helpful.
Yes.
Like I see Wendy Palmer was on your list. That
she was very well received, as was Paul Linden and some of the other martial artists.
Yeah, Paul Linden, right. That the cultivation of the body's strength seemed a really important piece for me.
Yes.
It's not easy. I mean, really to take embodiment seriously. And the people, for example, all of the trauma people who are going to these ravaged parts of the world to do service for people, that takes a lot of resilience and courage and strength, and literal strength. And people have to have bodies that are pretty resilient.
Yes. Yeah, I've done that work, and I think there's a piece I see 6 major influences on the embodied field, and they each add something. So the arts adds expressiveness, some add like bodywork adds sensitivity, and the martial arts really, really strong on robustness, and it feels like, and resilience, and it feels like we need to be in robust, resilient mode to face some of these challenges. So Constance, who's one of our speakers, makes a good point here in the chat as well. She's saying that maybe some of it's come from watching years of infighting, and how pointless that seems when I'm paraphrasing her here, when juxtaposed with the sort of big picture of what's going on, and people really needing something now.
And I was going to say about 10 minutes ago that I think there is a generational change that comes partly out of that realization, that the earth is disappearing as a viable home for us. And people are aware of that. So these little arguments about where the third cervical vertebrae don't really count very much. I mean, it's like
deck chairs on the Titanic, isn't it? A little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly.
Yeah. So on one hand, we have a gun to our head.
Yeah.
And on the other hand,
we have a hand on our head. You remind me of. So there's certain things that have endured in my long history. So 2 of those are, I get Rolf once a month by the same person I've been seeing for about 40 years. And I get sessions of osteopathy by a person who's a genius, who's taught Upledger and stuff. I'm just so grateful for the team of healers I have. So I think you know that I fell off a cliff about 8 years ago and broke my neck and all my ribs. And I remember the surgeon afterwards, when he took the collar off after about 6 months.
Yes.
I knew what the answer was going to be for myself, but I asked him just to see what he would say. I said, "Well, is there anything I can do about this now to rehabilitate?" There's nothing you can do. Just kind of go your way.
You're old, you're broken.
Yeah. So I've got this whole team of Chinese doctors and osteopaths and Rolfers and movement teachers and trainers that I feel so blessed to have.
Yes.
And I feel it's too bad that not many people know this, particularly as we get older. I mean, it's just...
I share my own experience here. Like, a lot of people have been giving me kudos this last 2 weeks, and what they don't see is that I'm seeing a therapist, a life coach, and a body worker every 2 days during this conference. I'm getting on average 2 hours of treatment a day.
Yeah.
And this is a fairly modest leadership position with nice people. It's not like leading a country or
right.
There's a lot worse things out there. It's just a minor challenge. But to be able to have those resources of somatic support and to have access to, coaching, to body workers, to embodied therapists, I mean, that's just a huge luxury.
Right. And I guess that's one of the rough edges of my life that's been hard, but I'm glad I did it. So there's a price to be paid for making the works more accessible. And in my case, by the circumstances I was in, I decided to go the route of state licensing and counseling as a way that was available to me to make a lot of people have works that were more accessible to the public. So that's been kind of the tough edge of my professional life over the years, how to navigate licensing and accreditation norms that come from people who don't really know what the work's about. They kind of have a rough idea, and they're mainly concerned with protecting the public and the visionary aspects of our work.
Yes.
So it's a hard road. I think I'd say it's the hardest part of my professional life, is trying to navigate that.
Yes, and I think so access has been a big thing for us at the conference. Being able to scale this stuff and make it free has been absolutely huge as part of what we're doing. And at first I thought there would be a trade-off with the online platform, and I'm now thinking of it slightly differently, thinking of it as different but not worse, even though it's far more accessible. And I know you're also interested in access from the point of view of kind of discrimination, or people that kind of don't feel like they can access the work. This sort of trickle down embodiment from the kind of white middle class of Northern California seems to have not worked. So like there's got to be a better way than that.
Yeah, and I think that what's another piece of that puzzle, and that's kind of what unfolded in this new book, is I think the thing that has to inform the very intense diversity conversations is more emphasis on sharing our suffering. So when I first started the field, I got very interested at one point. I realized that Ida Rolf was not teaching what she knew. And so I started following that. I would watch her work, and I would watch what she said, and they were just different. And what I started putting together was, this was an extraordinary woman. So here she was. She got her doctorate in 1920 at Columbia, when hardly any women were doing that. She went all over the world studying with all these interesting people at a time when women didn't do that. And then she got these inspirations and went about, like she would go around New York to all these people that had troubles that nobody was helping. And she would go for like $10 an hour or something and work on them. So all the way along the line, developing her work. So she was this radical, courageous experimentalist who had fascinating friends and reading capacity. She studied with different people in Tibet and China and everywhere. And then she taught us this kind of rigid 10-session recipe. She got them to do what she did. And what I came to realize is what would make us better, really, is if she were willing to share how much she had struggled to make her come to her discoveries. Mm-hmm. Instead of kind of letting herself be idolized as a deity or something.
Yes.
Which makes us feel like, well, we're dumb. We can't quite get what she's doing. So that kind of set me on a path of how did people, I mean, all of these people, Feldenkrais, Middendorf, Selver, they all went through deep suffering to put together the strategies that they came up with. And from the outside, people think, oh, this is just touchy-feely, feel-good, Mill Valley people. When in fact, it's people really struggling to make sense of their pain and how to negotiate life.
Yes.
So that's been a big motivator of mine, how to recover the ancient tradition of telling stories that reveal how we actually came to our work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the hidden histories, the personal stories, the human part, not just the kind of guru with the technique.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a struggle to do that because it's not fashionable in academic circles.
Yes.
Or even in the non-academic circle. It's considered, memoir, personal story. It's just personal story. It's not objective, blah, 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 blah. So it's not it's a hard way to go. I know there are certainly people in various universities all over the world who see this, but it's a very small number of people.
Some comments here as well. People are commenting, and there's a couple of people said, say more about it. Could you go back to what you meant? Say more about what, the two of you that said that comment. I've lost track of where that was in the conversation. Someone said that Charlotte Selver did reveal quite a bit of hers. Someone
Charlotte Selver what?
Charlotte Selver did reveal quite a bit of her story and stuff.
Yeah, she did. She was a rare bird that she did that.
Yeah. And Marion
Rosen. No. Marion Rosen also. Right.
Someone said, shared my personal struggle today and it felt good to be vulnerable. There's been in the breakout groups, particularly, quite a lot of people sharing deep things and feeling safe to do so. Sometimes some people have told me even safer than they would if it was an in-person group. It feels to me, Don, that your thinking and work has sort of turned slightly to the dark side recently, both in terms of the sort of environmental catastrophe, the political situation there. And I'm not saying that this is a criticism, just to be clear, but it seems like, I used to hear a lot of love and light coming out of California. And now what I'm hearing from you is a sort of wonderful darkness.
I think I've been more often than not an apostle of the darkness than the well, one of the strange things is I wrote my dissertation in philosophy on the relation between the changes in the body and changes in culture. And I did it because I witnessed in the 60s how people of goodwill who had these really great visions of what we could be ended up, when they tried to do collaborative work to reform culture, fighting with each other, tearing each other apart.
Yes.
And there were a number of people who influenced me around that time, that the way out of it, like Wilhelm Reich was one of them, and Norman O'Brien, Marcuse, that kind of the key to get out of this cycle of the old oppressed become the new oppressors, and they kill the old oppressors and so forth, the way out of that is the human body, to kind of get into embodiment and our life together as embodied beings on the earth. So I was very excited. I wrote that, and then I started pursuing a life of going along with that, changing people from this touch and movement and all that. And I lo and behold, 2018, it seems pretty much the same as it has been. So in our book, there's a woman named Taylor Elam who has a chapter called The Gap in the new book. And she's part African-American, part Native American. And she's been a really interesting activist. She's been going all over the country to these gatherings of one kind or another. She was at Standing Rock and many others. And she gave this poignant talk in my class the other day about how what she saw again and again and again as they travel around the country is that people gather for a visionary project, and within a day they're all attacking each other in these various groups. And so she went right into the heart of that. That's the work she's developing, is how do you go into those situations and help people really find their shared visionary goals instead of what they think everybody's doing wrong. So that provokes a certain darkness in me to see how little forward we've come in these 50 years. It's like, it seems we still are destroying each other instead of the people who are really the bad guys.
Yes, I've been, from my experience of various social movements and in, Aikido world and yoga world, I've actually been quite shocked at how little of that there's been at this conference. We've fended off a couple of sort of political extremist kind of attacks, essentially, but mostly with the participants, almost entirely, actually. It's been very open, and I'm curious as to why. The other piece that's interesting is...
Well, that's an interesting question. Like, what do you think?
I don't know. What do people think? Let's open it up. What do people think? I wouldn't have predicted it. I genuinely wouldn't have. I thought we would be...
That's quite extraordinary, this many people.
Yes. So in the chat, guys, what do you think? What led to it? I wouldn't have put money on it, Don. So, Isis, you've been on a lot of calls. Do you want to contribute to this?
I'm not sure what a good answer would be. What contributed to it?
Someone said we want change out of time for fighting. I think there's a sense of urgency, like, guys, we can't sit around anymore. I think that's maybe not the conference, but the zeitgeist, actually. Don't take credit for something that's there. Politeness, there's a certain politeness that's been here, a certain, yeah.
Actually, I think that, I'll say a personal word. I got a little annoyed with you about putting me in the category of body worker, as you know, and wrote you a note about that.
Yeah, my bad.
I could have gotten very upset about that. And you handled it so gracefully and non-defensively. And I think that counts a lot. I think your capacity to be generous and to go with the whatever needs to be handled so gracefully is very like an Aikido practitioner. That counts for a lot. You created an atmosphere of generosity.
Yes, thank you. I think there's a culture of generosity. I'll own that. I think I'm not particularly diplomatic in many ways, though. So that's I identified that as a weakness.
Well, that would make it very, kind of silly. If it would be too sweet or something. We don't want you sweet.
So there's a harem of like-minded people. There's definitely been a sense of a shared commitment to embodiment, I think, combined with this zeitgeist and maybe some things we did culturally that helped. I don't want to take too much credit for it. What's Daniela said? Daniela, you have the big picture. What do you think?
I think it's we set up clear boundaries pretty much from the beginning.
Yeah, we did it quite early, sort of said, look, this is not acceptable, these following things. And came down quite, rather than the sort of normal kind of hippie, it's all good, acquiesce kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the inquiry. It's nice to sort of feel into it. Often we're moving at quite a pace here, and it's nice to kind of go, not just to celebrate. I mean, the other piece that's come out of this, which is in keeping with what you're saying, is people have been wanting to continue it. And there's a way in which Daniela's doing that online, centralized. But also we realized like we needed a decentralized model. I based it loosely, the idea loosely, on two things. One is 12-step groups. And the other one is terrorist cells, actually. I've studied the history of terrorism and have interesting Irish family. So
I just applied for my Irish citizenship, by the way.
Oh, you did? I'm thinking of doing the same thing. if Brexit goes bad, I'm going to be calling up those grandparents. And
that's right. I got mine all ready to go. So,
but that's another thing that's not the top-down model. So I feel like previously there was like all these like keto fiefdoms and bodywork fiefdoms and yoga fiefdoms, and there's this idea of post-lineage yoga, and there's this idea of, you know, some of the staff were saying, look, we should control these groups and we should make them do it this way. And I said, that won't work. That would not work. It's not good, and I haven't got the time to try and manage it. But
that leads to another thing I thought a lot about preparing for this, which is I got into this in the early days through Carl Rogers and group work. So like that was one of the major shifts in my life, to the experience of sitting with a group of people who tried to listen to each other. I mean, that was brand new to me in my 20s. Nobody had ever listened to me in that way before. So I spent about 10 years in the orbit of Carl Rogers. I was at his early experiments with education in the LA basin. He had a whole school system he was doing experiences with student-centered learning. And so and then at one point, I realized I had to do more. I couldn't listen like Carl did. I couldn't sit still and listen. So when I encountered Rolfing, I thought, oh, now I can do this. And then, to my horror, we got into these classes, and there was no group process. So all these outrageous things were happening. People were doing terrible things to each other, and all kinds of emotion were coming up. But there was no group process. And I thought, this is kind of odd. And I think even today, I noticed that there's not a lot of attention to really serious levels of communication. Verbal communication and nonverbal communication as a group. So I think I would like to see a lot more of that in the embodiment field, where people have time to process all the wonderful things that come out of this work, and frightening things, and get closer to each other so that the work becomes more communal.
What are some of the mistakes you think that have really been made in the embodiment field, particularly in your own generation as you move towards kind of retirement and the grave?
It's unqualifiedly good to express yourself.
So not always to express oneself.
It's an unqualified good thing to express yourself.
Got it. I've been learning to keep my mouth shut at least sometimes during this.
Right. Yeah, that's what I've tried to learn over 85 years. Right. So that was a big thing in the 60s.
Right.
And Foucault was really great at this. Michel Foucault, he says what the Reichian model led to is a lot more profit for companies that are exploiting sexual expression. It didn't lead to freedom. It didn't free the society. It led to a lot more profit. So there was this thing at Esalen, where people just, Fritz Perls was terrible. You say good morning, Fritz Perls, and he just glower at you. He says, not a good morning. So there was a time when you just express whatever you want to express. So I think that was a really big problem.
Yeah. So I see, sorry, after you done.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I see a wider piece here of essentially integration of conservative values into embodiment. So you're talking about things like self-regulation, boundaries.
Yes.
I say this at the risk of upsetting a very liberal audience. And to be clear, I'm not talking about the Republican Party or the Conservatives in the UK or any political party. I'm talking about boundaries.
That's a very good point, because it's not just a conservative in our culture, but it's looking, I think that's the tribal peoples. Part of the wisdom of tribal peoples is the respect for long periods of initiation, long periods of learning how to do rituals, long periods of how to dance and do music within the tribe. And you don't just go out and do it on your own and come up with your own trademark. You learn as part of the community, and you're authorized by the community. So I think that's where the older wisdom traditions have a lot to teach about this just unbounded move into self-expression. The other weird thing that I just cannot believe has become such a slogan is the idea that the body never lies. It just seems to be one of the most obvious things in the world is the body lies all the time.
Yes.
So I think to really take seriously the depths of how much work it takes to interpret the signals that are coming out of bodily experience.
Yeah.
That is such an intricate thing. Yeah, go ahead.
I quoted you on this at the beginning of the conference on social media, and there was a social media post that I did that had the most pushback actually from the community. There's this sort of semi-sacred idea the body never lies, which is completely against any sort of Buddhist notion of or psychotherapeutic notion.
Or 12-step notion.
It kind of depends what you mean by that statement, right? So people were taking the statement apart and saying, well, it does if you do this and doesn't if you do that. But it's certainly something about the sort of po-face sacredness of how that's normally spoken, which is bullshit to me.
Yeah, right. So I think I would say more than a mistake, but the struggle is, how does one make a living and be a visionary? I just am awed that my students can come to San Francisco and afford to go through a program and afford to rent an apartment these days. It cost me, until I was 50, I didn't really care about making much money.
The millennials are better at this. The younger generation than me, they're better at being more business orientated, more money orientated, but still doing the heart piece. I feel like they've integrated the 60s and the 80s generations, in quite a nice way. For me, that was like, for this conference, I had to keep going backwards and forwards between, okay, this has to work as a business, and there's a bigger vision for the good of the world.
Yeah.
And every day there was this oscillation, and I'd go, okay, we're focusing too much on that. I need to make sure we sell some recordings. And then I'd focus too much on that, and I'd lose the heart piece a bit and have to reconnect the emotion.
Yeah.
It's been like an oscillation on a daily basis here.
And there it is. I mean, there's the karma yoga. It's like, without one, the others lose their ground. Dealing with accrediting boards and licensing boards, it's hard. It's very, very hard. And I think we just have to support each other doing that, because otherwise we're just making ourselves available for a few people who can afford expensive work. One of the strange things about Trump is that a lot of my old alternative medicine people are like Trump because Obama particularly supported biomedicine to such a degree, it was shoving out a lot of alternative methods. So that biomedicine has gotten so much incredible support, it's kind of shoved out all of these alternatives that when I was growing up, we had much more support in the medical community to do these things. I remember Emily Conrad was going to one of these research clinics in New Jersey, and we had many things going on at Stanford and at UCSF. Pretty much those things have died out because biomedicine has just become hugely supported and legalized at the expense of alternative methods.
Where do you think this embodiment world will be in 100 years? Assuming the planet isn't imploded and we, avoid nuclear war with Russia and all the rest of it.
Yeah. I'd like to see a lot more in the schools.
Mm-hmm.
It just seems an obvious thing. It's clear children come alive when they can be in their bodies and move. And I think one of the drastic problems with schools and the adults that come out of schools is 8 or 10 or 12 years of sitting still 6 hours a day, 8 hours a day. It's a deadly form. If somehow we could, and luckily, we're getting some headways into the schools in the Bay Area with our students, where our graduates are able to do more and more with taking students out into nature and having more movement during the day, more movement in the classroom. But it's very small right now. And I think that would be a great step for the health of the world to have schools much more aware of embodiment practices.
I'm also kind of feel like I want to flag how far we've come in that my niece, when she was 7 years old, she said, what kind of yoga do you do, Mark? And I said, I do this kind of yoga. And she said, what kind does Granny do? I said, Granny does like old school Iyengar yoga. It's kind of gentle now because she's old. And she said, what kind of yoga does my dad do? And I said, I don't think your dad does yoga. And she went, what? That's silly. Why not? At 7 years old. And she lives in a normal British town, not Brighton, in a pretty normal family. So I feel like there's some progress that yoga's become so commonplace that a 7-year-old would be surprised that her father doesn't do it.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful. Yeah.
Do you think we've made any other kind of progress, any other kind of headway here?
Well, I think there's got to be some meaning in the fact that embodiment's everywhere around that you look. There are yoga studios in every corner. There are massage parlors in every corner that are not just pornographic studios. people are out on my mountain. I live on Mount Tam, where the mountain bikes were invented, and thousands of people now are mountain biking, thousands of people hiking in places that I never saw people before. So there is a big turn to embodiment. I think the next stage is going to be, how do we explore together, like you're doing here? How do you explore, what is it that 5,000 people mountain biking up Mount Tam, what are they finding out about the world that would be very helpful for the world to know about? So I think that next stage, which is just around the corner, is the wisdom that's embodied in this big proliferation of everyday body practices.
Yeah.
I think of an experience, my first hours in Taiwan. I flew to Taiwan to do a training a few years ago, and when the plane landed about 5 a.m, so I had a couple hours to before the hotel opened. So I walked in downtown Taipei, and here were like 1,000 people of every age doing Qigong.
Yes.
And I thought, oh, this is fabulous. If they just took it one more level, what do they have to say about the shape of the world? It just seemed right there at the threshold of a new level of wisdom that would be really valuable.
So I'd love to incorporate something Dawn from Boulder said into some thoughts I was having earlier. It strikes me that embodiment culture was very individual. America's been leading the way and is ranked as the most individualistic country in the world, except for Israel, on all the social scales. You were talking about the power of community as well as individualism, and now we're talking about systems like getting embodiment into schools or hospitals, healthcare. Like, what is the tension between these three things? There's the individuals, doing our practice. There's communities like me encouraging people to start groups, not just to sit on your own and meditate. And then there's the actual need for systemic change.
Yeah. That's a big one.
Got 5 minutes.
What's big about it, why I kind of sighed, is where do you develop the practice? So it takes a lot of individual work developing the process. Now, the Asian model, to me, is too authoritarian in its form. So, and yet it does cultivate the skill. If we could work out a model in which there was a serious skill developing practice as a communal effort that had both the really serious interiority of the individual, but in a group practice, for example, I think that's what's kind of emerging around the edges. Like I have a fabulous Chinese doctor, but she really insists on the dogmatic top-down teaching. It's got all those edges to it. But she's fabulous. And I wouldn't take much for her not to be so authoritarian. It's not really necessary for the practice. So I think some amalgam of the kind of mental dissociated but freewheeling Western model with the very deep practice-oriented Asian models, but without the authoritarian bent. I think something in that realm is going to develop. It's already developing.
Combining the best of sort of individualism, communalism, and respect for tradition. And like I respect you as an elder, I really do, and I hope people feel that. But I'm also an iconoclast in another way. So there's a way in which I hold the lineage and tradition and a hierarchy between me. But I don't hold that hierarchy so rigidly I can't challenge you. Yeah.
I don't know if you've had much experience in the Southwest with the native people, but there's a group in many of the pueblos called the Mudheads. And the ritual function of the Mudheads, they dance, their bodies are almost naked, they're covered with mud, and they imitate all the sacred dances. So the Kachinas or whatever will be doing a very solemn dance, and the Mudheads will come in, they'll be farting, and they're lighting matches at their butts, and they'll mimic the dances. So there's always this sense of taking the edge off pretentiousness.
Yeah, that's why British, Irish, and Australian humor is very needed around embodiment communities, I would say.
That's right. That's exactly right. Right. Because it's that seriousness that kind of weighs it all down.
Yeah, I see that in the Jewish tradition as well. The ability to laugh, even
that's absolutely right. It's exactly the same as
humor, and
nobody can be too pretentious in the Jewish tradition, right?
Okay. Wow. This is, I feel like we should all take a breath, maybe take a moment. This is a hell of a far-reaching conversation. A few talks here, a few comments here. Lots of good stuff being said that I can't read everyone. Don, how do you want to end this?
How do I want to end it?
Life, world, talk.
Well, I feel an urgency about the planet. It feels so fragile right now, having been immersed in all these burnings, this huge hundreds of miles of burnt hills. And I feel we have to get busy here together, because nobody can do this in small groups. I think that's the way I want to end it. Let's get on with it. Let's get off the silly stuff and get on with the serious stuff.
Oh, Don, I love you. I love you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the support you've given for today, for your life. Really, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/embodiment podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodifacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. If you're, most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodifacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodifacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.